Elira Vaughn vanished without a struggle. Ronan Hale stepped forward as her loudest supporter, and Mara Kessler uncovered a pattern that proved this was never just a missing person case. Greyhaven was the kind of town people forgot to question. Streets were clean. Houses stood evenly spaced, and nothing truly unexpected ever happened. It was a place built on habits. Morning lights turned on at the same time. Doors opened at the same time. And people trusted that tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday. Elira Vaughn fit perfectly into that order. She lived alone in a small third-floor apartment, worked from a shared office downtown, and followed a routine so precise that neighbors could set their watches by her movements. Elira woke early, left at 7:45, and returned by 6. She bought groceries every Thursday evening and paid rent 3 days early every month. She did not socialize much, but she was polite and visible. That visibility was what made her disappearance so unsettling. When Elira did not arrive at work on a Monday morning, co-workers assumed a minor delay. When noon passed, worry set in. By evening, fear replaced reason. Her phone rang endlessly. Messages went unread. When police entered her apartment, nothing appeared disturbed. The bed was made. Dishes were clean. The bathroom light was off. Her wallet sat neatly on the kitchen counter. Her passport remained in a drawer. Clothes hung untouched in the closet. The only thing missing was her laptop. Investigators initially believed she had chosen to leave. Adults vanished for many reasons, and Greyhaven had no history of crime. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no neighbors reporting strange sounds. Surveillance cameras in the building were under maintenance that week. It felt like bad timing, not something darker. But Elira's work complicated the theory. She ran a small but focused blog that investigated financial fraud linked to local development projects. Her writing was careful, fact-based, and quietly disruptive. She avoided attention. Yet her research had recently pointed toward a company with strong political ties. The posts were still online, but her drafts were gone. As days passed, small details began to feel heavy. Elira had recently withdrawn cash. Not enough to disappear forever, but enough to suggest caution. She had canceled a dentist appointment scheduled months in advance, something she never did. A half-written note sat in her desk, unsent and unfinished, saved only as a file name that read backup. The town responded slowly. Posters went up. Volunteers searched wooded areas and nearby roads. The river was checked and rechecked. Nothing surfaced. No bag, no trace, no digital footprint, beyond her last login 2 nights earlier. Her email showed no plans, no goodbye, no hint of escape. Rumors filled the silence. Some said she uncovered something dangerous. Others said she finally broke under pressure. A few insisted she staged everything herself. Greyhaven had never handled uncertainty well, and now it sat at the center of daily life. Police attention faded after 2 weeks. Without evidence, the case stalled. Elira became another name in a file marked inactive, but the unease remained. Neighbors noticed her door still locked, her plants drying behind the window. The absence felt loud. What no one understood then was how carefully ordinary everything looked. The timing, the missing object, the calm. It was not chaos that erased Elira Vaughn, but precision, the kind that hides best in places where nothing ever happens. Greyhaven believed it had lost a woman. In truth, it had lost control of a story that was only beginning. As the search for Elira Vaughn slowed, one person continued to move with urgency, while everyone else drifted back into routine. Ronan Hale became a constant presence around the investigation, appearing wherever information was being shared. He lived 2 floors below Elira, and worked remotely as a freelance data analyst. Before her disappearance, most neighbors barely noticed him. Afterward, he was suddenly everywhere. Ronan was the first to contact police with a detailed timeline of Elira's habits. He described her work schedule, her grocery days, even the exact time she usually returned home. Investigators assumed he was observant or simply helpful. In a small town, People often knew more than they realized. Ronan spoke calmly, without emotion, and seemed focused on facts rather than speculation. He joined volunteer searches and organized them efficiently. Maps were printed. Routes were divided evenly. He created an online group to share updates and prevent false information from spreading. Many praised his efforts, especially Elira's co-workers, who felt abandoned by the lack of official progress. Ronan filled the gap left by silence. Still, subtle concerns began to form. Ronan knew details that were not public. He mentioned the missing laptop before police confirmed it. He referenced a draft article Elira was working on, even though her editor claimed they had not discussed it recently. When asked how he knew these things, Ronan explained them as educated guesses. He worked with data. After all, patterns were his profession. Investigators documented the inconsistencies, but found no direct link to wrongdoing. Ronan had no criminal history. His digital footprint was clean. His financial records showed nothing unusual. He had been living in Greyhaven for just over a year, long enough to feel established, but not long enough to be deeply rooted. What stood out most was his availability. Ronan never seemed busy. He responded to messages immediately, day or night. He followed up on every lead, even weak ones. When search groups dissolved, he continued alone, walking streets and alleys with a quiet determination that unsettled some residents. Online. Ronan became the public face of Elira's case. He posted regular updates, shared theories carefully worded to avoid blame, and urged people not to forget her. The attention brought in thousands of views, yet something about the tone felt controlled, emotional enough to engage, restrained enough to avoid chaos. A few residents began to whisper doubts. Why was Ronan so invested? Why did he speak as though he knew how, Elira thought? Some assumed guilt. Others believed trauma had bonded him to the case. Greyhaven preferred explanations that kept its image intact. Police re-interviewed Ronan after 6 weeks. This time, the questions were sharper. They asked about his past residences and previous jobs. Ronan provided a clean history with documents to support it. Cities changed. Contracts ended. Nothing unusual for someone in tech, but one investigator noticed something small and troubling. Ronan referred to Elira in the past tense, then corrected himself too quickly. It meant nothing legally. Emotionally, it lingered. As months passed, Ronan's presence did not fade. If anything, it became more structured. He archived every search effort, every message, every theory. It was as if he were preparing for something beyond finding Lyra to most of Greyhaven. Ronan Hale was the man who refused to give up. To a few, he was a reminder that the most dangerous intentions rarely announce themselves. They hide inside helpful gestures, quiet efficiency, and the comfort of someone who seems to care too much. By the time suspicion truly began to grow, Ronan had already shaped the narrative. And once a story is controlled, the truth struggles to breathe. The case might have stayed frozen forever, if not for Mara Kessler, a retired investigative journalist who had no connection to Greyhaven and no reason to care. She lived 3 states away and spent her time reviewing unresolved disappearances for a private archive she never planned to publish. Elira Vaughn's name appeared in one of her routine searches, and something about the lack of noise around the case caught her attention. Disappearances usually left chaos behind. Elira's had faded too smoothly. Mara began by collecting public records, old news articles, and digital traces. She built timelines the way she always had, placing events side by side until patterns began to surface. Within days, she noticed similarities between Elira's case and 4 others, spanning more than a decade. Different towns, different victims, nearly identical endings. No signs of violence, no bodies, no financial gain. Each person vanished quietly after researching powerful institutions. The connection was subtle but persistent. All 5 victims worked alone. All relied heavily on digital tools. All lived in apartment buildings rather than houses. And most importantly, each had regular contact with someone whose profession involved data analysis, systems security, or information management. Mara traced those connections further. Names changed, roles shifted, and companies dissolved. But one figure appeared again and again under different identities and job titles. Ronan Hale. Sometimes he was a consultant, sometimes a contractor, once a temporary systems auditor. Each time, he lived near the person who vanished. Each time he left the city. Within months of the disappearance, Mara contacted law enforcement. Quietly, she knew how easily theories were dismissed without proof. Investigators were skeptical, but curious. They had noticed Ronan's involvement, but never placed him in a broader context. Mara provided addresses, employment records, and timelines that were difficult to ignore. A task force was assembled discreetly. They reviewed Ronan's past with new purpose. His clean record began to look curated, rather than natural. Digital logs showed gaps that were legal, but unlikely. Employment contracts overlapped in ways that suggested planning rather than coincidence. Then came the break. A storage unit was discovered in a neighboring state. Rented under a false name, but paid for using a payment method linked to Ronan years earlier. Inside were neatly labeled hard drives, notebooks filled with symbols, and encrypted backups stored in outdated hardware to avoid detection. The data inside was disturbing. Each victim had a complete profile: schedules, contacts, financial behavior, psychological notes, risk assessments. Elira's file was the most recent and the most detailed. It included screenshots of drafts she never published, and research paths she had abandoned before anyone else could know. What stunned investigators was the absence of violence. There were no plans for harm, only containment. Ronan had not killed anyone. He had isolated them, erased their credibility, and pushed them into silence using legal pressure, planted evidence, and digital manipulation. The goal was control, not destruction. As investigators pieced it together, a new question emerged. Where were the missing people? The files suggested ongoing monitoring long after each disappearance. Locations were vague, masked through layers of encryption, but timestamps were recent. Elira Vaughn had not vanished by choice. She had been trapped inside a system designed to make resistance feel impossible. For the first time since the case began, urgency returned. Greyhaven was no longer the center of the story. It was merely the latest chapter in something far larger. Mara watched from a distance as her findings set events in motion. She knew better than to celebrate early. Patterns exposed truth, but truth alone rarely saved anyone. The search was no longer about what happened to Elira. It was about whether she could still be found. Before the system built around her decided she was no longer necessary, the task force moved quickly, knowing that time favored the person who had planned everything in advance. Digital forensic teams worked through the night, separating noise from intention inside the seized files. What initially appeared chaotic slowly revealed an organized structure. Ronan Hale had built layered systems designed to mislead anyone who looked too closely. Encryption was only one barrier. The real defense was volume. Thousands of harmless files buried the important ones, forcing investigators to question what mattered. Among Elira Vaughn's records, analysts found something unexpected. Her profile was marked incomplete. Unlike the others, her monitoring had not ended. Location data appeared fragmented, but recent hidden inside metadata attached to unrelated files. It suggested movement, not stasis. Elira was alive. This discovery changed the tone of the investigation. The focus shifted from reconstruction to recovery. Analysts followed digital crumbs left intentionally imperfect, as if Ronan expected someone smart enough to notice, but too late to act. Each trail led toward remote locations with limited connectivity, places where people could exist quietly, without official records. The breakthrough came from an overlooked detail. One hard drive contained weather logs, saved automatically by a background process. The data matched a narrow coastal region, where internet signals fluctuated in predictable patterns, combined with purchase histories tied to burner accounts. Investigators narrowed the search to a forgotten stretch of shoreline, far from Greyhaven, authorities moved carefully. They did not want Ronan to realize his system was compromised. Surveillance confirmed his routine remained unchanged. He continued, posting updates about Elira's case, urging patience, reinforcing the idea that hope still mattered. The performance was flawless. When investigators reached the coastal town, they found a woman living under a different name, working quietly, avoiding attention. Her appearance had changed. Her habits were restrained and deliberate. Records showed no criminal history because there was no official history at all. She existed between systems, exactly where Ronan had placed her. Medical evaluations confirmed what the files suggested. Elira had been subjected to psychological pressure, not physical harm. False evidence had been planted to convince her that exposure would destroy innocent people. Every attempt to speak out had been anticipated and blocked. Silence had been framed as responsibility. Once Elira was safe, the final phase began. Ronan Hale was arrested without resistance. His devices were seized. His networks collapsed quickly under scrutiny. Without his constant adjustments, the system he built unraveled. The trial revealed a motive that unsettled even seasoned investigators. Ronan believed traditional justice was ineffective. He saw exposure as chaos and silence as order. In his mind, removing people from the public sphere was a form of balance. He did not view himself as cruel. He viewed himself as necessary. Experts testified about his methods. There were no weapons, no violent acts, no visible crimes, until the pattern was revealed. Everything he did operated just within legal boundaries, exploiting trust in digital systems and human fear of consequences. The public reaction was brief and strangely muted. Without bodies or dramatic scenes, the story struggled to hold attention. News cycles moved on. The case files grew thick, but rarely opened. Elira refused public interviews. After giving formal testimony, she disappeared again. This time legally and intentionally. She chose anonymity over reclaiming her old life. For her, survival meant distance. Mara Kessler's role was acknowledged quietly. Her research was archived, referenced, but never celebrated. Studios reviewed the case and declined it. The story lacked a clean villain and a simple ending. It asked uncomfortable questions about control, consent, and how easily reality could be shaped. What remained was not closure, but awareness. The realization that disappearance did not always mean death. Sometimes it meant someone had learned how to remove a person without leaving a mark. The system that hid Elira was dismantled, but the idea behind it lingered, and that was the part no one knew how to erase. After the trial ended, there was no dramatic sense of relief. Greyhaven did not gather for memorials or celebrations. The town simply resumed its routines, almost gratefully, as if returning to normal could undo what had been exposed. The case was officially closed, labeled resolved without loss of life. On paper, it looked like a success. In reality, it left a quiet discomfort that never fully faded. Ronan Hale received a long sentence under multiple charges related to identity manipulation, unlawful surveillance, and psychological coercion. There was no public apology, no emotional statement, no attempt to explain himself beyond the framework already presented in court. Once removed from public view, he became exactly what he had made others become. Absent. For many, that felt fitting. For others, it felt incomplete. Elira Vaughn vanished again, but this time it was different. She was not missing. She was unreachable by design. Government records showed a legal identity change and relocation. Beyond that, there was nothing. No social media, no digital footprint, no trace of the woman who once believed truth should always be exposed. Those who knew her understood the choice. Survival had taught her that visibility was not always power. Mara Kessler returned to her quiet life with a heavier archive. She updated her private files, cross-referenced new data, and flagged cases that now seemed less isolated. The pattern she uncovered was not unique. It was simply one of the few that had been noticed in time. She stopped pursuing public recognition entirely. The work mattered more than the attention. The media struggled to frame the story. Without violence, it lacked spectacle. Without a body count, it failed to satisfy expectations. Editors trimmed it down to brief segments. Online discussions flared briefly, then faded. The case never became a series, never gained a dramatic title beyond what those close to it whispered among themselves. Yet the impact lived elsewhere. Digital security experts quietly revised protocols. Investigative journalists reconsidered how they stored research. Activists became more cautious about isolation. The idea that a person could be erased without being killed unsettled industries that relied on exposure as protection. Greyhaven's residents noticed small changes. People shared less. Neighbors observed without engaging. Trust became conditional. The town that once believed nothing happened there learned that silence could be manufactured. Years later, Elira's blog resurfaced briefly under a new domain, posting a single article without a byline. It contained no accusations, no names, no revelations. It focused on one idea: that systems designed to protect could also be used to control. The post went largely unnoticed before disappearing again. The case was studied quietly in legal and academic circles. It challenged definitions of harm and responsibility. It forced institutions to admit that legality and morality did not always align. Some called it progress. Others called it a warning. There was no final twist, no shocking revelation at the end. The truth had already been uncovered. What lingered was something less dramatic, but more disturbing: the knowledge that Ronan Hale did not invent his methods from nothing. He simply understood existing systems better than anyone else. The story never received a polished adaptation or dramatic reenactment. It remained scattered across files, memories, and unspoken lessons. Perhaps that was why it mattered. A Netflix-worthy case they never made. Not because it lacked depth, but because it refused to comfort. It offered no clear hero, no satisfying ending, and no guarantee that it could not happen again. And in that refusal, it told the most honest version of the truth.